Well, William now holds the immense responsibility of steering the House of Windsor into a highly uncertain future, operating with a level of independence that has quietly transformed Kensington Palace into an independent power centre. He stands, at the very centre of the institution, no longer just an heir in waiting, but the active architect of the royal family's daily survival. His position is one of quiet dominance, defined by a modern approach to duty that often contrasts sharply well with the traditional methods of the older generation. This position, it carries a staggering amount of influence as the public increasingly looks to him and his family to maintain the relevance of a 1,000-year-old crown. The stability of the monarchy rests heavily on his shoulders, requiring him to balance the delicate expectations of tradition with the urgent necessity of evolution. Every decision he makes, from public statements to private alliances, holds the potential, to shift the entire institutional balance of power. One of his most critical daily duties involves the meticulous planning of public engagements, a process that requires approving the precise timing guest lists and speeches for every single member of his immediate household. These schedules are typically negotiated weeks in advance with various palace departments to ensure a completely unified front. On this particular morning, William sat at his desk, reviewing a standard, seemingly routine brief for an upcoming summer afternoon garden gathering at Kensington Palace. It was a document of the most ordinary kind, listing the order of arrivals, brief background notes on the charity representatives, and the drafts of his welcoming remarks. As his eyes scanned the routine document, he stopped reading and remained entirely silent. He focused on a single handwritten annotation in the margin that bypassed the usual palace clearance protocols. It was a brief, unexpected instruction that had never been shared with Buckingham Palace or Clarence House. That single unapproved line on the page was about to completely blindside the king. William held the physical document in his hands, his fingers resting on the heavy cream-coloured paper that bore the official crest of Kensington Palace. This brief, was not an unusual document. In fact, such folders are prepared dozens of times each year by junior assistants within the communications department. They are designed to act as a safety net for senior royals, ensuring they are fully briefed on names, titles, and local histories before stepping out to meet the public. Under normal circumstances, these papers are read once initialed by a private secretary, and then filed away into the royal archives, where they are rarely, if ever, looked at again. They represent the dull procedural background of royal life, the invisible scaffolding that keeps the public performance running smoothly. No one in the household usually spends more than a few minutes scanning them, as they contain little more than polite pleasantries and logistical instructions. The draft before William had been prepared by a mid-level press officer who had worked quietly within the Kensington establishment for several years. It had passed through 3 separate administrative checks before arriving on the prince's desk, appearing completely identical to the hundreds of others he had approved throughout his tenure. Yet there was one glaring irregularity on the 3rd page of the schedule, tucked neatly between the arrival of the local dignitaries and the opening toast. A single sentence had been added, proposing that Princess Charlotte step forward to be introduced as an active representative of the crown. William, he did not call his chief of staff. He did not show any outward sign of anger or surprise. He simply closed the leather folder, placed it gently on the dark wood of his desk, and looked out the window toward the palace gardens where the marquee was already being erected. Instead of immediately addressing the addition, he spent the next 10 minutes reviewing ordinary household correspondence, signing routine letters to regional charities, and confirming the guest list for an upcoming diplomatic reception. The silence in the room grew heavy, yet the routine of palace administration continued without interruption. It was only as his private secretary prepared to leave the room that William finally spoke, asking a single quiet question about who had authorised the change on page 3. The answer he received was brief, yet it confirmed his deepest suspicion. The name of the person who had quietly suggested the change. It was someone whose influence had been growing behind the scenes for months. That single name had remained inside palace records for nearly 2 decades. William knew exactly who it belonged to. The public did not. To almost everyone outside the private offices of Kensington Palace, the name was associated with quiet professional competence. The individual who had penned that critical line was a highly respected public relations strategist, a woman who had spent years navigating the complex waters of British corporate and philanthropic life. She was someone who knew how to shape narratives, how to manage crises, and how to build lasting trust with the media. In public circles, she was seen as an entirely legitimate and reassuring figure. She had worked with major international foundations, received honours for her charitable contributions, and maintained a flawless reputation for absolute discretion. She was, the kind of professional who could blend seamlessly into any high-level meeting, appearing both capable and completely unthreatening to the established order. But her professional accolades, well, they did not explain why her name had stopped William in his tracks. The real mystery lay not in her public resume, but in her private proximity to the family. She had quietly become a trusted advisor to Princess Catherine, working in the background to analyse public data and study the changing expectations of the British public. Over several months, she had conducted highly confidential research, gathering detailed feedback on how the public viewed the younger royals compared to the king and queen consort. She was not a palace official, yet her influence had begun to surpass that of seasoned courtiers. Within the palace ecosystem, she occupied a highly unusual position. She was welcomed into private family spaces, attending small gatherings and discussing the future of the family's public image over tea. She had spent hours speaking with Catherine, analysing the public's deep affection for Princess Charlotte and Prince George. She understood that the true capital of the modern monarchy did not belong to the reigning sovereign, but to the children who represented the next generation. Her quiet consultations had slowly built a new consensus within Kensington Palace, one that well bypassed the traditional hierarchy entirely. Yet while the staff saw a brilliant strategist, William saw something far more significant. He understood that her presence represented a deliberate, highly organised effort to secure his family's position, even if it meant quietly overshadowing the sovereign himself. Her involvement was the first tangible proof of a parallel strategy, one that was being run entirely out of Kensington Palace without the knowledge of the king's advisors at Clarence House. She was the architect of a new vision, but she was also a direct threat to the fragile peace that had been maintained since the coronation. The payroll explained where she worked. It did not explain why her name still haunted the future king. That answer lay many years earlier, but not where most people expected. But the decision to bring Princess Charlotte into the public eye did not begin on that breezy summer afternoon. It actually started much earlier, during a private moment that almost no one outside the palace walls ever knew about. It was a cold Tuesday evening in late winter, during a quiet dinner at Kensington Palace that was supposed to be a simple, informal family gathering. The setting was entirely ordinary, far removed from the grand gilded reception rooms of Buckingham Palace. Only 3 people sat at the small dining table: William, Catherine, and the quiet PR strategist who had been advising them in secret. The meal was simple. The staff had been dismissed for the evening to ensure absolute privacy, and the conversation initially drifted through routine topics of school schedules and upcoming charity patronages. There was no sense of urgency, no expectation of drama. The atmosphere was calm, punctuated only by the soft clinking of silverware and, the crackle of a small fire in the hearth. But as the evening wore on, the strategist reached into her leather bag and placed a thin blue folder on the table. It contained a comprehensive summary of public polling data broken down by demographic and region. The numbers you see were stark. While the public held deep respect for the king, the emotional connection to the crown was concentrated almost entirely on William, Catherine, and their young children. The strategist explained that the king's public appearances were drawing smaller crowds, and his engagements were decreasing due to rising physical fatigue. She suggested with extreme care that the institution could not afford a period of quiet stagnation. The monarchy needed to show its future, and it needed to do so immediately. A quiet disagreement began to take shape. William hesitated, noting that traditional protocol dictated that royal children should not begin official duties until they had completed their primary education. He pointed out that his father, the king, would likely view any premature introduction of Charlotte as a direct challenge to his own established authority. But the strategist did not back down. She quietly argued that waiting several more years would allow the current wave of public enthusiasm to fade, leaving the institution vulnerable during a crucial transition period. The real issue beneath the surface, it was not Charlotte's age. It was a fundamental disagreement over who controlled the narrative of the monarchy. Then came the moment that changed everything. Catherine looked up from the report and quietly stated that she had already authorised a series of private media training sessions for Charlotte, designed to prepare her for public speaking and official cameras. The revelation hung in the air thick and heavy. William stopped eating and, he stared at his wife. He had not been fully aware of how far the preparations had already progressed. The room fell into a deep, absolute silence, the only sound being the wind pressing against the window panes. William did not raise his voice. He did not express anger. Instead, he slowly folded his napkin, placed it beside his plate, and looked at the blue folder containing the data that had prompted such a massive unvetted decision. He realized that his household had already crossed a significant line setting in motion, a plan that would inevitably lead to an open clash with the king. But the dinner did not end with a final decision, nor did it resolve the sudden tension between husband and wife. The immediate consequences of Catherine's revelation were left unsaid, lingering in the quiet room as the fire began to die down. The meeting appeared to end. It hadn't. Because what happened after everyone else left the room? Well, it would permanently change the future of the royal family. Charles sat in the high-backed armchair of his study at Clarence House, his hands resting heavily on the polished mahogany desk. Across from him stood William, who had been summoned to the private residence on short notice. The room, was entirely empty of advisors, private secretaries, and security detail. The heavy oak doors were firmly shut, sealing the two men inside, a space that had witnessed decades of family history, both triumphant and deeply painful. The silence between father and son was suffocating. Charles did not immediately look up, choosing instead to focus on a small stack of papers before him. William remained standing, his posture rigid, his expression entirely unreadable. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room seemed to grow louder, with every passing second counting down the moments well before the inevitable storm. "You should have consulted me, William," Charles said, his voice quiet but carrying a sharp, unmistakable edge. William did not flinch. "The decision was made in the interest of the institution, father. The public is looking for continuity, and we must show them that the future is secure." "The future is not yours to define while I wear the crown," Charles replied, looking up to meet his son's gaze. The frustration in the king's eyes was clear, a manifestation of months of feeling sidelined, overshadowed, and physically exhausted by the demands of a role he had waited his entire life to inherit. The confrontation, it escalated quickly, not with shouted accusations, but with a series of sharp, deeply personal exchanges. Charles argued that William was moving too fast, disrupting the established hierarchy, and ignoring the delicate balance of royal protocol that had preserved the monarchy for generations. He accused his son of prioritizing popularity over duty, of allowing modern public relations to dictate the actions of the sovereign family. William countered that the world had changed and that relying on old methods was a recipe for slow irrelevance. He argued that Kensington Palace had to act because Clarence House was failing to connect with a modern audience, pointing out that public enthusiasm was dwindling. Then Charles slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was an internal confidential report from the Royal Security Detail, detailing the unapproved media training sessions that had been arranged for Princess Charlotte. The document proved that Kensington Palace had been operating in complete secrecy, utilising private contractors who had not been vetted by the king's household. The emotional balance of the room shifted instantly. William looked down at the report, realising that his father's intelligence network within the palaces was far more effective than he had assumed. The confrontation became quieter, the words well more deliberate and deadly. "You are acting as though the transition has already occurred," Charles whispered, his voice trembling slightly. That single sentence hung in the cool air of the study, exposing the raw, unspoken truth that lay at the heart of the entire conflict. It was not about a garden party, nor was it about a young princess's public role. It was about the quiet, systematic transfer of actual power from a fading monarch to an impatient heir. William remained silent for a long moment, staring at the security report. He did not deny the accusation, nor did he offer an apology. The silence that followed was far more powerful than any spoken defence, confirming to the king that his son well. He was no longer willing to wait in the shadows. The meeting did not end with a compromise or an agreement. There was no reconciliation between father and son, only a deep, permanent fracture in their professional relationship. The emotional fallout was absolute, leaving both men deeply isolated within their respective households. The family conversation had ended, but the monarchy was only beginning to respond. Camilla immediately understood that the personal confrontation between the king and the Prince of Wales had resolved nothing. As she entered the king's study shortly after William's departure, she found her husband sitting in silence, staring blankly at the empty room. She knew that family dynamics they were no longer sufficient to contain the crisis. The matter had now crossed a critical threshold, moving beyond personal relationships and entering the formal, unyielding machinery of the British state. Camilla, in particular, was determined to ensure that her hard-won position was not compromised. She had spent decades rebuilding her reputation, and she was not prepared to watch the authority of the king be quietly dismantled by an impatient Kensington Palace. She attended several of these confidential briefings, quietly urging the advisors to take a firm stand against what she viewed as a dangerous usurpation of royal authority. Within hours, the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace and Clarence House became hotbeds of intense, highly confidential activity. Senior palace officials, including the king's private secretary and veteran constitutional advisors, were summoned to an emergency meeting. These individuals, who serve as the guardians of royal protocol and institutional stability, were tasked with evaluating the legal and constitutional implications of Kensington Palace's independent actions. An official, highly sensitive review of household protocols was quietly initiated. This review, it did not focus on the emotions of the family, but on the strict rules governing royal representation, public funding, and security clearance. The legal counsel for the Duchy of Cornwall was quietly consulted to determine if Kensington Palace had exceeded its financial and administrative authority by hiring unvetted external contractors for Princess Charlotte's media training. Behind closed doors, palace administrators began drafting a series of highly confidential memoranda. Revised guidelines were prepared, outlining strict new protocols for any public announcements regarding the minor children of the royal family. These documents were designed to quietly strip Kensington Palace of its ability to make unilateral decisions, ensuring that every future public step would require absolute clearance from the sovereign's office. The discussions among the private secretaries were tense, with some suggesting that a compromise could be reached to allow Princess Charlotte to attend a limited number of events under joint supervision. However, the prevailing view was that any concession would be seen as a sign of weakness from Clarence House. The final document presented to the king for his signature was absolute in its terms, leaving no room for negotiation. The result of these intensive consultations, was a single major institutional decision that would permanently alter the balance of power within the family. The king, acting on the formal recommendation of his senior advisors, signed an executive order transferring the absolute authority over all public engagements involving royal minors directly to the central press office at Buckingham Palace. This decision effectively stripped William and Catherine of their independent control over their children's public debuts. It was a silent, devastating blow to Kensington Palace's parallel strategy, reasserting the king's absolute supremacy over the future of the institution. Yet this massive shift in authority remained entirely hidden from the outside world. No press releases were issued, no public statements were made, and the mainstream media continued to report on routine royal engagements. The country, it remained completely unaware of the intense constitutional tug-of-war occurring behind the palace walls. The institution had completed its decision. Now the consequences begin. William watched from the window of his private office as the immediate visible consequences of the king's executive order began to take physical shape within the palace. There was no public announcement, no dramatic press conference, but the internal machinery of Kensington Palace had already begun the cold, systematic process of rewriting reality. The decision had been made, the documents had been signed, and the entire household, they were now forced to adapt to a new, heavily restricted existence. The first visible change was the immediate cancellation of several high-profile engagements that had been quietly penciled into the autumn calendar. The draft schedule that had sat on William's desk, once representing a bold new vision for his daughter's public role, was quietly shredded and replaced with a heavily redacted version. Any reference to Princess Charlotte attending official ceremonies was completely erased, her name replaced with standard generic placeholders. Across the courtyard, palace staff responded to the new directives with a quiet, sombre efficiency. Communications officers who had spent weeks preparing media strategies for the garden party were reassigned to routine administrative duties. Vetted security files for the external PR consultants were quietly flagged, and their access badges to the private offices of Kensington Palace were deactivated without explanation. William he observed these quiet adjustments without uttering a single word. He did not confront his chief of staff, nor did he attempt to appeal the king's decision. He stood in absolute silence, his hands clasped behind his back, watching his team dismantle the elaborate plans that had been designed to secure his family's independent future. The silence in his office was deafening, a poignant reminder of the absolute authority that the crown still wielded when challenged. The consequences of this quiet clampdown quickly rippled outward, affecting other senior members of the royal family who had to navigate the sudden shift in power. Catherine, who had spent months carefully planning Charlotte's preparation, was forced to accept the sudden halt to her strategy, channelizing her energy into her existing charity patronages while maintaining a flawless, smiling public face. Princess Anne, ever the loyal servant of the monarchy, was quietly asked to take on several of the engagements that had been left vacant by the sudden restructuring of the autumn schedule. For Charles, the victory carried a heavy emotional burden. He had asserted his authority as king, but in doing so, he had deeply fractured his relationship with his eldest son. A deeply personal moment occurred when Charles walked through the quiet corridors of Clarence House and stopped outside the guest rooms that William and his family often used when visiting. The rooms, they were completely dark and silent, the sheets covered in dust jackets, the desks entirely untouched. Charles found a small handwritten note that Charlotte had left during her last visit, a simple drawing of the family, on the desk in the library. He stared at it for several minutes, his eyes reflecting a profound sadness. He realized that while he had protected the crown, he had created a chasm between himself and his grandchildren that might never be fully bridged. In the administrative offices, senior courtiers quietly began restructuring the long-term succession plans, ensuring that any future role for the royal children would be strictly monitored by a joint committee representing both Clarence House and Kensington Palace. This move ensured that the independent operations of the Prince of Wales's household would be permanently curtailed. Yet despite the intense internal drama, the public remained completely oblivious. The garden party went ahead as planned. The photos of Charlotte smiling were published in the newspapers, and the media continued to write glowing articles about the seamless unity of the royal family. The palace had successfully rewritten reality behind closed doors, but the tension, it had not disappeared. One final meeting remained a quiet conversation that would determine whether the family could ever truly survive the devastating decisions that had been made in the name of the crown.